Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth time together, our third main session of the Cultural Policy Action Lab, a national leadership development program supported by our friends and partners at Grantmakers in the Arts. My name is Randy Engstrom. I have the privilege of being one of the co-designers of this program. My pronouns are he, him. I hail from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people in what is now Seattle, Washington. I'm an able-bodied, white-presenting male, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. In a minute, we're going to hear from some of our other partners and our featured presenters today. We're very excited to be joined by Forecast Public Art. They're going to talk all about public art. But I wanted to first let you know just a little bit of housekeeping. We have captions enabled. Q&A is going to happen throughout this presentation. So if you have a question, you can go into the control area and put in your question. We'll be answering where we can throughout. We'll also have a dedicated Q&A at the very end. This is being recorded. It will live on the GIA website underneath with the other Cultural Policy Action Lab presentations. And we'll be sharing that after the event. So you'll have a chance to go back and hear this information more than once if you'd like to. With that, I'd like to acknowledge behind the scenes, Estrella Escalin, one of our partners in crime in running the Cultural Policy Action Lab. And I'd also like to invite my friend and colleague, Jen Cole, the third part of our team here in designing the Action Lab. Jen, take it away. Jen, your audio is not coming through.
Our apologies on the technical difficulties.
All right, Jen is going to get that audio figured out, but I'm going to say, it's our practice to move past land acknowledgements and to land actions. We are here for the Action Lab and Indigenous self-determination. And one of our invitations to you today is to review the current volume of Poetry Magazine, Land Acknowledgements, edited by Esther Berlin, and Estrella can put that in the chat if you don't mind. And today, just to remind everybody, the Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series is a leadership and professional development community of practice program for public sector workers who seek to advance racial equity through arts and culture and through public policy. We are continuing this 8-part learning series. There's our definition. We're continuing our eight-part learning series with our third sort of focused session, which is around public art. We grounded public policy and racial equity in the public sector. In our first session, we went deep into public investments and grants in our second week. In our third session, we heard about placemaking, placekeeping, and infrastructure. And today it brings us to public art. And we are thrilled to be joined by probably the best people we could have ever hoped for to be doing this presentation with you today, our friends at Forecast Public Art. You're going to be joined today by Teresa Sweetland, who is an experienced executive director, fundraiser, curator, and leader in the field of community and cultural development and creative placemaking. Sorry, I'm going back. We're going to hear from Jen Krava, who's the director of programming at Forecast and sets the vision for consulting work at Forecast Public Art, manages the Change Lab, and works on projects invested in community-driven public art. Mark Salinas is a Reno-based public art consultant and curator. He's the senior manager at Forecast Public Art, developing arts and culture strategic plans, policies, and creative workforce programming for nonprofits, developers, airports, as well as municipal, county, and state arts agencies nationwide. And Yarlene Rosario is a public art manager, artist, and producer based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, driven by community advocacy, trauma-informed practices, and the arts. She specializes in strategic planning, relationship building, and project development. Welcome to our friends at Forecast. So excited to have you here. As I mentioned, we want the land acknowledgement to be a little more action-oriented. And even in this time of COVID-19, when we're all physically distant and dispersed across the US, we'd like to recognize that we are all grounded and connected to Grantmakers in the Arts, who's hosting us, which is located on Lenape land in what is now New York City. This acknowledgement is meant to be a means to recognize the history and legacy of that colonialism that displaced the first peoples there, and where we are speaking to you from today. We are all connected to sanctioned and unsanctioned policies and continue to benefit from that legacy through our compensation to facilitate this session today. In addition to shifting policy in the public sector, which is why we're gathered here today to discuss, a beginning step in the work to dismantle our own internal and structural colonialism beyond this territory acknowledgement is to support these tribes and these sovereign efforts in this critical time through resource and financial donations. For more information, please check the links that we're posting in the chat right now. Some folks that we think are terrific candidates for investment: NDN Collective, Native Women Lead, First Peoples Fund, Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, and again, a link to that essay about land acknowledgements from Poetry Magazine. So here we go. Sorry about that abrupt technical shift. Now, please join me in welcoming our guests, Yarlene, Mark, Jen, and Teresa from Forecast Public Art. Thank you. And we're really excited to have you here, and we're really excited to learn more about public art from the folks who do it as well as any.
Thank you so much, Randy and Cultural Policy Action Lab, for inviting us to be here today. My name is Teresa Sweetland. I'm the Executive Director of Forecast, she, her pronouns, and I live on the traditional lands of the Dakota Oyote, which is now called Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm going to start out today, and we're going to introduce ourselves as we go, and I'm going to do a little bit of introduction to Forecast, but also to public art policy, specifically in the history in this country. So, but I want to start out with our own land acknowledgement that we use at Forecast. Today we're talking about public art, and all public art is on Native land. And so we respectfully acknowledge the sacred land upon which Forecast home offices are located in St. Paul, Minnesota, the traditional homeland of the Dakota Oyote. And this image that you're seeing here today is a Dakota land map. And this is speaking of action, this is a public artist named Marlena Miles, who's a self-taught Spirit Lake Dakota Mohegan Muskogee artist located in St. Paul. And she created this map as a public artist, and something that lives in many public spaces now throughout the St. Paul, Minneapolis area. And allows people to learn about language and location through an artistic creative form and mapping process. And so just wanted to share that, the creation of an artist to start out with today. And our team, as you'll hear, works and lives across the country. So we all acknowledge, as part of our accountability and practice, the Native people and land which we engage in work. And we, like Randy said, invite you to learn more about the history of the land that you're working on and creating on, and listening and learning from and collaborating with Native people here today. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So for today's presentation, our team has 4 key takeaways. So we hope today that you leave this time with us getting some knowledge about the history of public art policy in the US, examples of imbalances in public art policy and their effects on community, practical ways to infuse equity into public art projects and policy, and also ideas that will influence the future of public art policy in the US. So hopefully we get some good action in our action lab today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Forecast Public Art and our role in the public art landscape. So we're an independent nonprofit arts organization. We're also a public art consulting, technical assistance and training team. We work in and with communities around the country. We were founded by artists for artists over 40 years ago. I'll talk a little bit about where we fit actually in the history of public art in the country. Next slide, please. So our mission is to activate, inspire, and advocate for public art that advances justice, health, and human dignity. And we do this because we imagine a future where all people feel a sense of belonging, realize their potential, and live healthy lives by embracing culture and creativity as drivers of equitable change. And this new mission and vision just adopted a few years ago, right? In April 2020, actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, is really what guides all of our work now, along with our values. So next slide, please. And sharing values, I'm really glad Cultural Policy Action asked us to share values, because these are the values that guide our decision-making in everything we do. We believe in just distribution of wealth, opportunity, and privilege. We believe in aligning with others fighting for equity, justice, and human dignity. We believe in environmentally and culturally sustaining policies and practices. We believe in relationships of mutual investment between community sectors, disciplines, and professions. We believe in inclusive practices that invite and honor the full expression of people in place. And we believe that creating an equitable future requires bold imagination. And you'll hear these values come through our team today as we talk about why we do this work and what matters. Next slide, please. So we do three main things. We support artists directly who work in public space. And that's everything from funding artists with grants ourselves to providing them with professional development and also connecting them to work. Next slide, please. Secondly, we help other people, including organizations, government institutions, many public and private partners who want to connect with artists to do so more successfully and equitably. And this could be anyone from a city to a federal transit agency to a neighborhood organization or housing developer and many more. We do this kind of work extensively in the Midwest region, but we've been expanding around the country. Next. Next, please. Thank you. And then third, we build capacity and we share stories and research. This looks like training for people who want to learn about this work at the intersection of equity and public art, conducting research around racial justice and Indigenous visibility in public art, and also our publication called Forward, which is a free digital publication that it talks about the role of artists as partners in tackling the most vital issues of our time. And in the last 3 years, we've launched many new initiatives to really address the systemic racism and equities in our country's public art policies and practices and collections, and to start to address our collective trauma. And we'll hear more about that as well. Next slide, please. So I'm excited to talk about context and history. I love this invitation to share about the history of public art policy. And before getting into the policy history, I just want to acknowledge that there's always has been and always will be a robust public art community outside of government that's artists provoking and innovating and culture bearers leading, from street art to public performance and ritual and public protest. And that's a really robust part of our public art community here in the US. And we'll talk about, we'll cover some key moments in public art policy history that created the public art infrastructure that we have today inside of government. We also want to talk about a lot about individual artists, community members, and the role that they play as partners in this ecosystem. So next slide. So here's a little brief overview of some main history points. And I'm going to start with the 1930s. So next slide, please. So 1930s, we see the WPA and the New Deal arts programs, and these really focused on individual artists. They helped give public funding directly to artists and created thousands of public artworks that belong to the public, available to the public in schools, libraries, hospitals, community centers, and other public agencies around the country. And we can see thousands of these works still in communities across the country. Next slide, please. So following that period, the 1950s program art and architecture was really the groundwork for today's public art policy. So this is what developed the Percent for Art program, which is the structure of funding that public art still predominantly utilizes today. This program gave 0.5% of total construction costs of all government buildings to purchase contemporary American art for that structure. And in 1959, Philadelphia adopted the first municipal ordinance in the US. Other jurisdictions followed: Baltimore in 64, San Francisco, Hawaii in 67, and Seattle in 73, and then kind of an explosion of programs across the country following the same model of ordinance. And more than half of the states now maintain Percent for Art programs. On the federal level, since 1963, the GSA has maintained the Art and Architecture program, and nationally, 283 of the about 350 programs are located within government agencies, city, county, and government. So that means the rest are located outside of government in partner and collaborative organizations. Next, please. In 1965, the National Endowment for the Arts founded its Art in Public Places program. And this was the first time that substantial federal tax-based funds was given to art spending on local levels. And today you'll see over 300 government-funded arts programs in the US in public arts projects all over the country. Next slide, please. In 1974, the adoption of this CETA program was very similar to the WAPA from the 30s. This again funneled many hundreds of millions of dollars to visual and performing artists to work in cities. Unlike the WPA, CETA was administered by local city and county agencies. Because it was a jobs program, it really focused on skill development for artists and not as much on the artworks themselves. But artists were working in community-based organizations. It was really a time when a lot of community-based organizations around the country were founded that still continue today, embedded in neighborhoods and communities. Next, please. So at this time, Forecast was founded in 1978 as a part of CETA. That time period, CETA's direct benefit to artists included training and financial support. And Forecast was really founded by artists who wanted to work in this space and didn't see enough support directly to artists to continue to work in public agencies, libraries, community centers, hospitals, et cetera, as CETA was coming to an end since it was such a short-lived program. Next, please. And then kind of fast forward to after the 2009 recession, a collaboration of public and private partners, national foundations, the NEA come together to form ArtPlace, which forms the national creative placemaking and creative placekeeping era, 10 years, we're just came to the end of, really focusing on art as a driver of economic development to really rebuild the economy in our country, and supporting cross-sector partnerships largely between creatives and cities. And this resulted in many, many public art and community-based projects around the country that we see coming out of this era. Next, please. And then now, sparked by both the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on really shutting down the arts infrastructure in our country and bringing more attention to public art as people could access more public art, and also the murder of George Floyd, the racial reckoning around racial justice, and the call in our nation's streets by artists and public artists to address racial justice, we enter into this era of really investigating who is represented in our nation's monuments and memorials and public art collections and who is not. And this is really growing attention every day. And we'll talk more about this as well in our presentation. Next slide, please. So this is really that tension that you see here of the past coming together with the reckoning of led by artists and communities to bring attention to representation in our country's public art landscape, and infrastructure. And so this is just a short overview of public art policy. There's many more available resources out there that we encourage you to find and can share. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark Salinas and go from there.
Thanks, Teresa.
You're welcome.
So now we're going to take a look at the imbalances that we see in our own consulting work and share some strategies to identify and communicate how we can rethink public art policy so that it better reflects public interests and lifestyles and habits. So for purposes of today's presentations, we're going to use this graph to plot process and people, which we believe, when successfully overlapping, creates really good examples of public pride and participation within communities. So horizontally, we see process, and vertically, we see the people. And this is simplified. My colleagues will point out later that these 4 opportunities for policy upgrades share the same DNA. But at the intersection of process and people, we have public art. And the definition of public art in municipal and state public art ordinances, public art master plans, percent for art projects, currently distinguishes what is eligible to be funded and what is ultimately handed to the public. We benefit from CIPs, both public and private development projects, which extend funding to create new art. And I offer the following slides as examples of observations where public art ultimately ends up being absorbed into our daily routines, our daily patterns, lifestyles, and habits. And perhaps we can expand current definitions to include these broader public experiences. Next slide, please. So from left to right here, we have Le Grand Vitesse in Grand Rapids, Michigan by Alexander Calder that was funded through the NEA, as Teresa had mentioned. In the center, I See What You Mean in Denver, Colorado by Lawrence Argent. That was a CIP funding. And the Gateway Arts in St. Louis by Eero Saarinen. That's federal funding actually through the signing of a bill into law by FDR. So these 3 immense artworks are superb in my opinion. And naturally well known both inside and outside of their own communities, if not globally. And it's my belief that intrinsically that this type of public art wants to distill and embed itself, its identity within the public's daily routine, its community lifestyles, and become a permanent moment in the public's everyday thought. So beyond creating mental mapping and placemaking, we often look for ways to connect with public art, to identify with it, and to carry it with us. Next slide, please. So I want to share some patterns of observation where the public seeks to embed, seeks to be embedded and embrace itself, where public art seeks to embed and embrace itself in daily public experiences. Here we have the silhouette of Le Grand Vitesse, serving as the logo for a municipality. We see it turn 90 degrees and become the logo of an arts organization. There in Denver, that big bear represents romance riders to roller derbies. And the silhouette of that arch, commercial sports leagues to independent chess matches and actually being a part of identifying public health. So I want us to look at some examples of public art that lean towards temporary daily interactions and exchanges as what is presented here in front of us. Next slide, please. So on Houston and Bowery in Manhattan, there's a permanent wall that's managed by a developer who has a curator that invites renowned muralists to paint temporary works. In essence, this permanent wall has become what I believe to be almost like akin to a theater or a stage where there are limited showings. And so people are always going to this wall to see what the next great artist being shown is, and it's only there for a temporary period of time, although that place is duly established as an arts venue. Next slide, please. The repurposing of pre-existing spaces Also creates venues for shared experiences, such as this airport, utilizing its vacant parking lot during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Another example of rotating outdoor galleries is seen here in the Madison Square Park Conservancy, where rotated artwork is in fact large installations. So this is artwork by Ivan Navarro. So I show the slide just to represent that temporary always does not imply small artwork. Next slide, please. However, sometimes it does. And it has the ability to leave a permanent memory while leaving no trace, evaporating in the air. Next slide, please. So art already exists in airwaves and in pixels and in space. Dance, radio, music, poetry are all wonderful examples. In looking at this article from the New York Times, you would think that this is pointing to the pandemic, but this slide is actually from 2005, underscoring this public precedent of redefining art. Next slide, please. Forecast helped redefine art a bit last year and a half ago when we were hired by Smart Growth America to administer its Arts and Transportation Rapid Response, which was an initiative for transportation agencies looking to creatively and quickly address pandemic-related transportation challenges that they were facing with the aid of an artist. And among the national agencies that we worked with was MARTA, the Metro Atlantic Rail Transit Authority, who had increased ridership of homeless, the unhoused, due to reduced capacities during the pandemic at shelters. So while this was a bit of a standing issue historically for MARTA, the pandemic had created increased hardships for this marginalized community, and MARTA sought to connect and educate and provide assistance to these passengers and to the community at large. Among the application pool was Franco Bejarano, a licensed clinical social worker already working with the Atlanta homeless population, who's featured there in the center. And he had been noticing that when he was able to connect his clients to housing and he was helping them move in, that they were often alone and there was no one to share this powerful life milestone with. And based upon the relationships that he had cultivated through his profession, not as an artist, but as a clinical social worker, he would ask to take their photo and from it create these nearly life-size hand drawings of these people. Next slide, please. So directed by MARTA's Hope Outreach staff, he directed his professional assistants and creative connections to rail stations that were populated with the unsheltered. And over the course of months of this project, quite naturally, he created relationships, and from that, new drawings to humanize and dignify these people's lived experiences, as well as sharing methods of obtaining assistance in all forms. And the end result took the form of vinyl installations that were installed throughout the MARTA system. So this artwork, I believe the medium of this artwork was beyond vinyl, and it was actually relationship and trust and respect, and as a result, bringing awareness and aid to the unsheltered. And it's just one of my favorite examples of public art. I urge you to watch a 6-minute Vimeo that MARTA created of this project, and thank you for putting in the chat. At the conclusion of this, please check that out, and as well support MARTA Artbound and Franco Bejarano. So thank you for that, and I will pass the baton to Jen.
Thank you, Mark. So Mark just talked about the middle part of this diagram, the definition of public art, right? And that is basically the foundation of a public art policy. You have to define what can be created with money through the policy. So understanding all of the ways that public art can be defined helps us understand what could be funded and how we're distributing that across our communities. So I'm going to talk about the horizontal axis on this diagram, which we're thinking about as the processes, right? Funding and placement of artworks. And I like to think about these as distribution points, right? So distributing funding to artists across the country, distributing artworks across communities, but also what is the distribution of the artists who are making the artwork, and what's the distribution of the content of the artwork itself. Next slide, please. We know that public art contributes to a community's identity. It highlights uniqueness of communities. It can become a source of pride in community members. This is a mural by Shek Vega, which is in San Antonio. There are images of community members on it. There are words that describe what this community values. The next slide is another example of an artwork that does the same thing. This is the next slide, please. This is the Wall of Respect mural, which was created by William Walker. It actually does not exist anymore, but this again highlights issues that are important to people and were important to the people in this community. They still are important, but this started, the Black arts mural movement across the United States. Next slide, please. So in policy and public art, funding is mainly tied to capital improvement projects or CIPs. That means that public art will be located where the capital improvement project is being located, right, for the most part. There's a lot of nuance in public art policy, so I just want to put that out there. But generally speaking, one of the major ways that public art is funded through policy is taking a percentage of a capital improvement project and devoting that to public art associated with the CIP. So this image is a map of Southlake, which is a suburb outside of Fort Worth, and it's a map of where upcoming CIP projects are happening. So by looking at this map of CIP projects, we can get a sense of where public art projects will be located over the time frame that these projects will be happening. Again, nuance to policy, but this essentially then means if the only funding source in this community is through CIP projects, it means that if a community has not had a CIP project in the past and doesn't have any coming up, they also won't have any public art projects, right? Again, there's nuance. But like we talked about before, public art helps communities share their identities and values, right? So if public art funding is tied to CIPs and a community doesn't have a project upcoming, then they aren't able to share their stories and what they value. Next slide, please. As Mark talked about in the definition of public art, as part of policy, many times it's defined as an object-based permanent artwork, like this streetcar stop that was created in Portland, Oregon by an artist named Jorge Pardo. These are definitely a main part of public art and need to continue to be funded, but they're not the only type of public art out there, right? So if we think about what it takes to create a sculpture like this that is permanent and going to last, 25 to 50 years, it requires a very special set of skills that not every artist in the country has even had the opportunity to develop. Next slide, please. If we think about policy being tied to static, object-based artworks and sculptures, it also immediately discounts artists who are working in more ephemeral media like textiles or performance. And the image on the screen right now is of artist Seitu Jones's project called Create, the community meal. And not only did this huge community meal happen, but the food was presented through performances by servers. there was an entire process that led up to this meal of community engagement and relationship building that wouldn't necessarily be a part of an object-based or CIP funded policy for public art. So if we think about artwork that is based in textile or performance or storytelling, these media are commonly and many times tied to cultural arts or cultural arts programming, which then means that we're limiting the stories that are being told through our public art projects and who is telling them. Next slide, please. So what can we do? How do we start to balance these things out? This image is of a graph that came through a report that we did with the city of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, which is a suburb of Minneapolis. We worked with them to do an equity audit of their public art collection. And what's showing on this graph is who was getting commissions. So we looked at gender and race of artists. We looked at when they got the commission. We looked at how much money they got and started to see where there were trends, but also like where are the gaps, so that when the city is looking at their policy, looking at their ordinance, looking at their public art plan for next year or the following year, they know what gaps there are and they can make their plan around what is missing in their collection, what's missing in who's being represented in their community. The next slide shows another layer of that equity audit that we did that places the public art that already exists on a map to see where it's being distributed, right? What neighborhoods are getting public art. We also looked at what kinds of public art was being distributed across these communities. And then we also looked at census data, like who lives in these communities? What's the median income? How much are people paying for houses? And are there people who own their houses? Are people renters? Right? So we started to look at like who was actually being represented, where the artworks were being distributed. And then that becomes another point of reference when the city is developing public art projects in the future to say, this community, this neighborhood has not had any public art, it's public art desert. Or this community has so much public art, we can wait, we can put them into the cycle in a couple of years. One thing that I like to recommend is that public art programs and public art managers of programs do an equity audit like this every year so that the plan can be set up for the next year for projects, and you can start to really distribute artworks and funding to artists and communities in a much better way. I'm going to pass it to Yarlene now to talk about the other axis of the diagram.
Hey, Yarlene, you're muted. If you could start over.
Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. This is not my first time on Zoom, but thank you for joining us all. I'm going to ask you to direct your attention to the vertical elements on this diagram, artists and decision makers. So in this case, artists we're focusing on commissioned artists and decision makers as public and private sector partners that are in positions of power. I'll be sharing a bit about the power imbalance between these 2 points and ways to move towards equity in public art policy. Similar to some of the work that Forecast does for public art collections around the country, Monument Lab did some work around monuments and memorials that I'd like to share with you. So next slide, please. For those who are not familiar with the work of Monument Lab is a nonprofit public art and history studio based in Philadelphia. Monument Lab works with artists, students, educators, activists, municipal agencies, and cultural institutions on participatory approaches to public engagement and collective memory. It was founded by Paul Farber and Ken Bloom in 2012, and Monument Lab cultivates and facilitates critical conversations around the past, present, and future of monuments. So the image that you're seeing here is actually from their most recent national audit, looking at monuments all over the country. So the orange points on the map represent the location of an existing monument, And for this research, Monument Lab studied 48,178 monuments nationally. And in their findings, they found that the monument space is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. The story of the United States is told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. I wanted to make the connection here between the image that was shown previously, mapping the number of public art programs across the country, with this map, documenting public monuments, which have existed before some of these public art programs and whose presence has impacted our cultural landscape. I wanted to make this point to really highlight that lack of representation within our history and these processes. Next slide, please. So in the image, you can see before me right here is a projection of Breonna Taylor, a Black woman with shoulder-length hair and a blue jacket. Breonna was a full-time EMT for 2 hospitals in Louisville, Kentucky. She was murdered in her home by police. I'm going to ask everyone if we can just take a moment here and pause in honor of Breonna. Thank you for sharing that moment with me. This projection of her image lived on the Robert E. Lee Monument, one of the only remaining Confederate statues on Richmond's historic Monument Avenue. The light projection artist is Dustin Klein. Klein uses his art to change the meaning of this contentious monument. As we learn about imbalances in public art policy, we see how artists have recontextualized the meaning of what has already been decided on, honoring underrepresented stories and creating new ways of seeing. Next slide, please. On this slide, there is a bronze statue of Harriet Tubman pictured and a boy. This piece was commissioned by a local municipality. And the reason I wanted to share this example is because there was some tension around this piece. The total commission for this piece was $500,000. And it was given, the opportunity was given to a white artist without an opportunity for a public process. This created tension between the local community that wanted a Black artist to be commissioned and a public process for this artist call. The public art commission meetings were held between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. during working hours, which limited who could participate in these conversations. And usually the people that can't participate are people that are traditionally and historically underrepresented and working class people. I share this example to highlight the procedures and processes that create imbalance in representation in some of these systems and can also create trauma and lack of trust within community members. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, thank you. And this slide, the following images are from a client project where Forecast helped lead community engagement for an artist selection. Community engagement is really important to this work as we're thinking about ways to really balance the scale. And I say that because it offers new ways of connecting and uplifts the idea that site-specific art requires site-specific decision makers to be involved. So, for example, people who will be most impacted by the artwork in various contexts, apart from physical, we're looking at the cultural and historical impacts of artwork when they are going to be placed on a site and making sure that we're hearing from the people who are going to be most impacted throughout that process is really important, and ways that we can really create art-centered conversations to merge those gaps, those language gaps. And I want to share another example. Next slide, please, on moving towards some of this rebalancing. So this slide, the following images from this slide are from Forecast's Making It Public workshop series. And today, Making It Public is a 5-week workshop. It's held virtually, and it's offered separately to artists who are interested in exploring and expanding their public art making practice, and arts administrators who are interested in strengthening local capacity to support, create, and promote public art. The intention for the series is to recognize people within these systems who are doing this work and need partnership to move the equity work forward. and really making those connections, really merging, making those that bridge there. Next slide, please. And now going back to the diagram here, in addition to creating spaces for honest conversation to move towards this rebalancing, it requires access and opportunity for artists to build their skills. So we have that up here. And not only are we looking at training artists and educating artists to be more informed about these processes, we're looking to help decision makers learn how to make processes more inclusive of community members and their needs. So that's as simple as creating a board meeting, a public board meeting in the evening, or having multiple meeting sessions, or recording a session, and providing language accessibility. And we decided to put this little third bullet outside of the diagram, which is building community trust. So aside from policy, moving towards slowing down processes and to really listen to people and to see what they have to say about the current state of where we're at, right? And just really listening and rebuilding that trust. I want to just thank everybody. I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Jen Krava, to share a bit more about the horizontal points.
Thanks, Arlene. Yeah, that point about building community trust is really the foundation of being able to have a strong public art program. It's not necessarily something you write into policy, right? It's an action that you need to do, and it takes a long time to build, but you have to start, and it's a really important piece to the entire public art ecosystem. So, as I talked about before, if we look at funding, definition of public art and placement, just expanding all of these things, right? Expand the definition of what public art is and can do in your community. Think about where you can expand actual public artworks, and then think about what kinds of artworks can be funded through your policy, and expand on that as well. I'm going to pass it back to Teresa to talk about one more initiative that we've been working on to help rebalance some of these policy issues.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that, as we're talking about the imbalance and thinking about whose voices are leading the future of public art, we think about Forecast often is working with communities and cities in setting the next plan for new public art programming, new ordinances, and who is leading that? Where are we looking for new research about the future? Where are we looking for new voices and that are going to set the next policies that are going to drive beyond the percent for art policy that is focused on capital? What is the future of public art policy that is focused on people, the people-driven, people-centered policy of the future? And so we've started a new initiative called the Change Lab, and this is really about giving funding and support for the time for people who already are working in and with public art to do new research and in specific areas. And so Amina Cooper is our first Change Lab fellow. She's worked as a public art administrator in government and outside. And she really focused her research around public art and racial justice, and specifically doing a nationwide survey to look at where the representation of Black artists in public art. And that is ongoing, but really looked at it from a process basis. So what are the upfront processes that are either barriers to Black artists being commissioned and having opportunities within public art? What are the processes that are inclusive and inviting to Black artists being a part of the public art infrastructure? And so that research is ongoing and will be shared back as we get more. We also have our fellow Jessica Mehta, who is working on Indigenous visibility. So again, when you look at many public art programs or even our own programs today, we have the start of a land acknowledgement, which is really the beginning of Indigenous visibility, but it is not moving beyond into action, into the system that we want to see changed. So Jessica is looking at public art policies around the country through the lens of Indigenous visibility, and then going to be making recommendations about actions, about changes in ordinances that increase Indigenous visibility, artworks and commissions and support for Indigenous and Native artists. And I'm sure many other ways that she sees that the public art policy in this country can be disrupted in order to benefit BIPOC communities. And so that's where we're really thinking about the future of public art policy. When we see these imbalances, when we see heavy investment to capital and infrastructure, and the desire to have more, and the call by our country and by our community and by artists to have more of an investment in relationships, in community building, in racial justice initiatives, into focusing on health and healing and trauma-informed processes, but we're not yet seeing those in our ordinances and policies. And so, and we want to see how we can make recommendations to communities, to cities, to federal, state, county agencies to start changing these policies to be more people-oriented. So the Change Lab is a part of that, an initiative that we look forward to partnering with others to find out how to share this research and information throughout the field, both in our public art field, but also within cultural policy more broadly, but also to just engage and start to see the faces and the voices and the decision makers of public art change as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, next slide, please, what this policy platform concept is looking at. So part of exploring and investigating these imbalances, by many of us, both Forecast, Monument Lab, this work by the Cultural Policy Action Lab, the focus on this effort within public art administrators, our partners and collaborators who are embedded in government, who share these same values, who share these values around changing public art policy to be through the lens of racial justice. We see the opportunity for a policy platform to work together and to offer this nationally to our colleagues and to our communities and to our sector. And so one effort that we're engaging in right now is nationwide listening sessions that are going to happen in communities around the country that are very specifically listening to artists and communities, BIPOC artists and communities very specifically, to understand from community members directly, what do they want to see in public art of the future? What is the infrastructure, systems, processes, opportunities, funding look like from the perspective of communities? Do people feel represented? Do people feel like they have the trust, like Jen talked about, with their partners in government in order to work together to start to balance out these imbalances that we're talking about. So again, these listening sessions, we will take these listening sessions and bring them to a national convening, hopefully in partnership with others here today, to talk about, to really workshop and think about how can we take public art ordinances of today, how can we break apart and disrupt the percent for art imbalances and offer new solutions and offer new opportunities. And then where could those start to bubble up, and where are the communities in the country that are willing to try out, more people focused, more community focused, more relationship focused ordinances and policies. So that's something we look forward to as a part of this conversation today, to identify networks and partners who want to work together with us on developing this policy platform, and to hear from others who are doing work to balance the imbalances in public art that we're sharing today. With that, I'm going to say thank you from our team and have the opportunity to open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Yarlene, Jen, Teresa, Mark. That was so rich. Thank you for everything that you shared. Lots of really exciting themes that connect to conversations we've been having over the last several weeks. This idea of disrupting the imbalance and the inequities that exist in the current policy space, the idea of fostering trust and relationship, beyond materiality, beyond projects and programs, and being more people oriented. Those are all like really strong themes that have come through. Happy to open up space in the Q&A for discussion, and maybe I guess I could stop sharing my screen because we're all here now, and we'll bring back the emails of our guests in a moment. But Jen and Mark and Yarlene and Teresa, hello. And I guess I'll start with a question while we let other people get settled. And then Jen, I think I saw your hand go up as well. But thinking about, Yarlene, you brought up some really specific barriers to procurement. But you know, the direct selection of a white artist to do the Harriet Tubman sculpture, the hours when the Public Art Committee met that aren't accessible to folks who work regular jobs. Are there promising, beyond changing meeting times, have you seen any innovative approaches, innovative policies around the country that have lent themselves to more equitable outcomes? It can be for any of you, but.
I would say, and I have a background in local government, and I think something that I noticed that was pretty innovative was the community engagement piece, including that in all of the projects across departments, and really that community engagement piece, building in that contingency right in the beginning of the process to make it like, so we know and understand that the outcome might change, being flexible in that approach. Instead of saying, hey, we're just going to put this building here, it's like, okay, where are there elements that we can actually open up and get feedback from the public about this building that's going to actually get built in the next couple of years. So I'd say community engagement. There's a community engagement activity that I really love, and it's been like art pop-ups, just doing like different things, whether it's performance or yarn bombing a tree, like, or I've seen phone hotels where you drop your phone off and you do arts and crafts in the park. Just a lot of creative strategies there. I'm mainly including community engagement as part of the process early on.
Yeah, so one of my questions is also on the artist side. And so sort of policies that you've seen that have allowed those artists who, you know, sometimes are gapped in the capacity to sort of enter into a public commission, right? So sort of they don't have fabrication ability, or they don't have a track record of that. And so often those are huge barriers when you go to solicit a public commission. Even if you have the community engagement kind of embedded in the practice, often the only people who get to bid are people who have kind of a CV. And so if you could kind of talk a little bit about experiences that you've seen in sort of onboarding artists who don't have that. Like, for example, in Nashville, one of the things we did in our public art program a long time ago was actually only require folks to submit two-dimensional portfolio, and then we actually offset that, and we manage the fabrication contracting and on the subcontracting, so that we would take on the insurance burden and some of the other kind of administrative burden, so that artists didn't have to. And that was kind of an onboarding for onboarding a lot of artists who normally wouldn't have thought of themselves as applicable in commissions. Talk about some other things that you've seen around really kind of widening who the artists are who kind of feel like they can kind of come in for commissions. And
yeah, I like word of mouth, asking people when at the community engagement events, learning from that people have an interest in art and taking note of that. So reaching out and keeping those contacts. But going back to like building in the training into the process. In the past, something that I've done is I've had sessions on how to apply, or offering video interviews, or even like a one-page sheet, sharing your Instagram account, and really being open and flexible to that process, and then understanding, okay, where might you need training? Where is there an interest, and how can we make it fit? So really working on, if I'm better at working with the contractor or maybe the solicitor, I'll navigate that conversations, but how can I include the artist along the way to be right there with me? So that's a learning opportunity as well. So really building and training as much as possible to any project along the way, and understanding the artist's capacity is like the approach that I really enjoy my work.
So there are two questions in the Q&A that I'll start with one out loud. Ellie Patronus, her says, when thinking about unsanctioned public art, graffiti, street art, protest art, tagging, what work is being done to build trust amongst those artists and government?
That's a really good question. I'll start, and then team, if you want to jump in, please do. I will just say that we think that that unsanctioned artwork is just as important as the sanctioned work is. And so when we are working with the municipality to develop a public art plan for them, we develop processes that continue those grassroots and unsanctioned artworks to be able to happen while providing guidance on how to build in that sanctioned piece of work. So I think there are communities across the country who are public art programs and public art administrators who acknowledge and see that sort of unsanctioned work happening in their communities, and are thinking about what kinds of resources they can offer to be able to help that artist out, right? So one very local example here is in the city of Hopkins. We're working with them on a project on a development, and there's a huge gravel pile in where the development is going to happen right now. And one morning they woke up and there was an artwork built on it of like a face. And one day it was smoking a cigarette, and one day it was doing something else. And it was totally unsanctioned. And the public art program managers wanted to know who did it so that they could go to that artist and say, hey, we love what you're doing here. How can we support you in being able to do this further, right? But I think when, and this is not every artist, but sometimes when an artist does an unsanctioned work and then is contacted by the city, they might get a little nervous about what that conversation is going to be, right? So I think public art program managers thinking from a lens of how can we support this? What kinds of resources do you need? And that includes funding, but what else can we provide you? Is it training? Is it figuring out ways to get insurance? You know, like what are all the things that that program manager can do in addition to just giving funding to projects and managing that project cycle?
But Ellie, another thing that we did in our community was actually create a really simple infographic of all the different sort of scenarios that an artist working in community may experience, and sort of so that they would navigate, and also often offered up our public art and community and neighborhood organizer staff as navigators, so that they didn't have to take on the labor and sometimes obstructionist behavior that other public agencies will often throw at an artist. And so I think there are things that you can do both policy wise, but also practice wise within the government to sort of be that kind of bridge for community facing artists. Meg has a question. Are any public art programs out there exploring or engaging in paying reparations, for instance, setting aside percentage of public art projects budget toward BIPOC communities and or cultural centers? Apologize for that.
I can take that. We're actually working in the city of Alameda right now, and the city itself has distinguished an $11,000 tithe gift offering that it's giving its indigenous inhabitants there. So I think this is working on, as it well should be, working on larger platforms than just arts and culture. I also think that just as we are convening here nationally, it's just as important that locally, if we're talking about municipalities and arts commissions, that they are in communication with each other. Spanning the state of Nevada, we have a lot of rural and urban art commissions. And I think keeping abreast of what our neighbors are doing is important, as well as being a voice of a partnership. We recently here in the city of Reno created, our Arts Commission created a land acknowledgement. And we're an advisory board to the city council, and the Human Resources Commission, which is another advisor to the city council, caught wind of this, wanted to make their own. So we partnered with them. We shared these findings with Clark County and Las Vegas and Sparks, and trying to lift up so that we have accrued voices following the same ethical paths. That got elevated to our state's art agency, which just last month created its own land recognition in foot with Washington and a lot of the East Coast, West Coast states. So I think within, creating BIPOC opportunities, a lot can be done within commissions, and I think it should start there.
I wanted to ask a question around I believe it was Jen who earlier in the presentation talked about not commingling funds where the physical site and the capital improvement budget may be, and sort of other examples of innovations in defining the artwork outputs in policy, and be specific or give examples if you can, where that has allowed folks to sort of move funds from the capital improvement project that generated the funds into other communities or neighborhoods, and some creative innovation of language that you've seen work in those places.
I mean, I'll start by saying policy language is usually pretty dry, right? So it's not like a fun read necessarily, but I will share, we're working with the city of Red Wing, Minnesota right now on an arts culture plan, and are actively currently writing their public art policy with them. So it hasn't passed yet, but I will just share with you that a lot of that comes through in the way that they are defining things within that policy. So there's a whole list of definitions that talk about what public art is and can be, starts to list out some things, but then also makes more generalized statements about how it can be a performance or it could be an event, right? So it's general yet specific so that things can fit within, but there's a way for so there's some direction, but there's also room for other things to come in that maybe we haven't thought about yet. Fargo, North Dakota has a really robust public art policy, again, coming through in those definitions of what can be, not only what is defined as public art, but what can the money from a capital improvement project be used on. And many times it's not just the artwork, but we need to fund the administrator who's working on the project, right? And who manages that public art program. We need to fund maintenance and make sure that the artworks that are permanent in nature are being maintained and continue to live up to the community pride that they instill from the beginning, right? And they continue to look and function and not be a liability to community safety through those funds. So thinking about not only like how we're defining what public art is within that policy, but defining where the funding from a capital improvement project can be utilized outside of the artwork itself.
Right. So I'm hearing sort of in kind of places to lean into the policy language are funding, sort of what is allowable within the funding, the where, and then one of the other areas that I found helpful is what defines permanence. So for example, in order to fund a community-based initiative that went alongside of our city general planning process, one of the ways we creatively interpreted our existing ordinance was it said that the product of the capital budget had to create something permanent that was owned by the specific department, right? Sort of another municipal department. And so we were able to creatively interpret the word permanent and ask basically an artist. We hired printmakers all over the city to work with the community to do sort of community-based print events. And the permanence, the community-based project got funded for more than 12 months, but the permanence was a book that was then owned by our city public library that was accessible to the public permanently, right? So like really looking at that language so that around money, permanence, and site placement that I think can often we have folks interpreting those policies and there's a lot of wiggle room that we sort of don't push for inside those policies. So.
And just to add to that, I think policy is always based upon precedent.
Yeah.
And that it's often easier to include language than it is to propose editing altogether or scrapping new language. And so if there is room just at entry level to include a CIP funding for to add events, pop-up, ribbon cutting-esque additions to a static object, I think that's one way just to get a little closer to start collecting precedent of that popularity itself.
That's a great suggestion of adding commas into ordinances is so much easier than changing the ordinance altogether.
And Jen, I want to go back to your question earlier. Something that's also worked for community engagement has really been going to people and bringing the information to them. So like Laundromat Project is famous for doing a series in laundromats. So making sure that we're going to be able to reach as many people as possible, and we're going to them, so it's not added labor to come to that city council meeting or to travel and get on this board meeting, and making sure it's really an exchange.
Absolutely. So yeah, anything we can do to reduce artist labor on understanding the policy and increase their investment, right? It sort of moves that from what the policies we have that are inherently racist and towards sort of things that are more about understanding well-being and self-determination. Other questions that we have? Randy, do you have one?
Well, there was one that that came up in the chat earlier that I just didn't want to fail to flag, which is how the forecast is determining those listening sessions that you're having. Like, where are they happening? How's that being decided? Maybe if you could unpack that just a little bit more.
Yeah, I can start, Teresa, if you want to jump in then. So we are working with regional advisors across the country. So there's an advisor that we're working with in the Southeast, one in Northeast, Northwest, Southwest, and we're working with them to figure out what the best way to deploy these is. Where should they be? How should they be facilitated, right? We're at the very beginning of that process right now, but we do have a team that's distributed across all of the regions that will help us to figure out the best way to make those happen and how they should be facilitated. Teresa, did you?
Thanks for that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I think I was just going to say the same thing, and that this has been a process in play for a couple of years now, so that we can be very region specific, like Jen said, and identify the best community-based organizations that have the deepest connections within community to partner with, et cetera.
A question for you.
Thanks for that.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jen. No, I was just going to add that I appreciate that theme of regionalism as a policy strategy, because a policy is most often local. I mean, obviously there's national policy, but being able to affect change quickly and nimbly, often taking a regional approach can be effective. And we've thought about how to utilize regional networks as a way to advance equity in the public sector generally. It's interesting to think about that specifically through public art, and how that also, you know, Nadia and I were chatting in the back, and just this notion of trust, how you establish or reestablish or repair a sense of trust between policymakers and community, and artists being the sort of connective tissue in the center. I think it's really interesting how that theme of trust comes up over and over again around how to effectively bridge community and policy. But go ahead, Jen.
I was going to say, like, sometimes moments of chaos actually breed some innovation in kind of, and also city governments will sometimes under emergency declaration sort of get a little less intense about their policy interpretations. And I wanted to know if any of you have observed something that happened during the pandemic that you felt like, oh, this has stickiness and we should keep doing this. We can continue to sort of change this policy. Anything at the municipal or regional level that stood out to you as kind of being a really interesting innovation?
Well, so I'll just say, sometimes the most innovative things are the like smallest changes, right? So something that we have seen sort of shifting over the last few years, but think and promote as a best practice is to use an RFQ or request for qualifications process rather than an RFP or request for proposals process, right? An RFP is asking for ideas, and we're asking people to do work and submit an idea without any sort of guarantee of being paid or getting that commission, right? An RFQ asks them to submit a letter that says why they're interested in this, and then their resume and work samples, so things that they should already have ready to go, so it's a lighter lift. And then through that process, artists are asked to develop proposals, but they get paid for that work, right? So again, like, I don't know how you define innovative, but I think it's like a really simple change that can happen and make a huge difference. If we go back to that equity audit in St. Louis Park, one of the things that we asked them to do or suggested to them was change the headers on the spreadsheet that you are tracking your public artworks in. Add in questions about artists' race and the content of their artwork. Start tracking information about how many projects they've had with you and how much they've been paid. Start tracking how much female identifying artists have been paid versus male identifying artists versus non-binary artists, right? Like, track all of these details. And really, it's just a simple change in the headers on that spreadsheet.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I've been seeing more and more of are like when you're making a fairly large public commission requiring as part of the commission a mentorship component of 2 to 3 emergent local artists that are mentored alongside of that larger public commission, so that they're paid to sort of become part of that process. So there's really kind of a circular learning process between sort of maybe lead artists and the sort of those who are sort of in a learning mode, and making sure all of that is compensated. So I think these are exciting.
I just want to add a shout out to the 11th Street Bridge Park project,
Yeah.
because not only are they developing artwork and hiring mainly local artists of color to develop those artworks, they have thought about what equitable development looks like. They've thought about how they can provide resources to community members through the construction of this project so that they are not displaced. They've given grants out to people. They've helped people start businesses. Like, there's a whole dimension of work that they're doing alongside the public art projects that start to build even more tighter community relationships and uplift the people who already live in this place so they can continue living there, that this park and this public art is for them.
Jennifer, sort of answering your question about recent policy changes. You know, I can tell you from our state arts agency perspective that, you know, we've changed the language from specifically for our folk life program grants from CV to biography. because a lot of our cultural bearers don't necessarily have an exhibition list of exhibitions, yet they have stories of impact in their region, in their community. We've also lowered the threshold for certain grants, operational budgets, bringing those down so smaller organizations can apply.
Those are all excellent. Do you all have a question for each other? What's one hope that you like, if you could wave your magic wand, and I believe in magic, and something was fundamentally different from public art policy in 5 years, what would that one thing be that you felt like would be move the needle the most from what we've been doing towards a just future? What would that one shift be?
How many wands do we have to wave on this question? Just one?
Well, I think something that we've always at Forecast is given grants and funding directly to artists to do what they want in public for decades. And so much of this work in this field is artists responding to a pre-existing ideas, pre-existing budgets, pre-existing dreams. And I think we continually want to wave that magic wand to say, like, ask artists what they want to do in your community when it comes to public art. And that tie to capital improvement is one of the ways that we keep artists from being able to do what they want to do in their own communities with their own visions and dreams. And so creating ordinances that put funding aside to give money directly to artists for what they want to do, I think is a really important step to see in our change in our policy infrastructure.
I'd also love to wave a magic wand and have municipalities understand and utilize the benefit of public art in a way that they do other services that they provide to community members. So we really like to think about public art not as this standalone thing, but as a vehicle that can help other sectors, other city departments or municipal departments meet their goals as well. So thinking about how we can cross-pollinate these ideas and help people understand, like decision makers in power, understand that public art can help them reach a goal. It can help them meet their values, right? It can help build relationships with community members. It's not just a standalone piece of artwork or object, right? It does so many other things.
Within the past few years, our capital was the recipient of a DOT. I want to say it was the new name for the Tiger Grant. Anyhow, it was millions of dollars for a new thoroughfare. And artwork was not allowed to be one of the expenditures. And of course, they came to us wanting something for the roundabout, but unable to provide funding. And so I guess my magic wand would be that we're kind of talking about CIPs on a city level, but let's also think about that on a national level.
And if I'm gonna wave my magic wand here, I'd say my hope is that we hear more diverse voices, that we pay people for their experience, and seeing more diverse voices in positions of leadership, really.
Those are all laudable magic wand endeavors, and I hope every single one of them comes to fruition. We had a couple of questions that we wanted to get, a couple more questions from the audience that we wanted to get to in the chat, and then maybe we'll try to wrap after this. But there's a question from Kristen in Oakland about sort of the inherent limitations around CIP projects. Even the flexible ones carry some amount of rigidity. She's looking at examples of cities that have identified new funding sources or other different models for supporting temporary work, the administration, maintenance, policy development. There's all these one-time placemaking resources, but then you get to make that place for a period of time and then you don't have any recurring funding. So I think looking at models of where that's been done, where you've seen that innovation around the country.
I'll just share, there are some policies out there, and the one that we're writing in Red Wing right now has a clause that says that the Public Art Commission can spend up to a certain dollar amount of their funding in whatever way they decide without having to go to council to get approval for that. Right, so they can use that to give grants out directly to artists without having to, tie it to a capital improvement project like what Teresa was talking about. So that's one example of how to think about, broadening the tie of the funding to an actual project and give it directly to artists.
Yeah, there's usually, 3 prongs to any successful, to a sustainable arts programming. And that would be, if TOT, transit occupancy tax, hotel tax, is one funding mechanism, a line item in the city's budget. And wow, the third one escapes me. It'll come back to me. But through those other mechanisms that are not tied to bond language, there's your opportunity to create precedent without restrictions to build your local platform for advocacy.
One of the other things I was going to say is often we would often work with other agencies who had less restrictive sources of funds that could be deployed towards community-based engagement. The public health department has to do a community health improvement plan every year that requires them to have community input. There's nothing in most of those ordinances that says that they can't hire artists to do that work. So there's often these other sort of city agencies that are doing collaborative work around community and temporary stuff that their ordinances are often more allowable. It's often that creative interpretation or getting them to add that comma that we were talking about. So I would sort of encourage you not just to look within your own agency, but to look in these other city agencies that do have statutory requirements around engagement sometimes in their processes, and often they will be open or open-ish to working with artists and paying artists in that creation of that space and that temporary work.
Sort of offshoot of sorry, go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, I was just going to share, in Minneapolis, outside of the public art department, they have a creative city making program inside of the cultural economy department, and that has built more with a focus on finding ways to embed artists inside of other departments, bringing outside funding in from private foundations to kind of build the value and pilot artists working with planners on engagement or racial equity plans, et cetera, until that department sees that incredible value of working with artists on those efforts and then starts to build it into the budget. So in our this was prior to being at Forecast, but when I was director at Intermedia Arts, and we started a relationship with the city of Minneapolis, eventually those planners who are working in partnership with artists, not on the creation of artwork, but on the engagement, the creative, innovative, trust building engagement with communities, started to see, well, this is the kind of work that I have a budget for to do community engagement. But as a planner, this may not be the skill set that I have necessarily always brought, but the skills that an artist in partnership with me, I don't want to now give that up, right? I've had incredible benefit of all of these really creative and fun and interesting and context-driven strategies that now the planner, when they're developing their budget inside of community planning and economic development, are saying, here's my line item for an artist now, and starting to build that ability for them to work with an artist, like you're saying, Jen, outside of public art. And that was in partnership with the public art department, who said, the public art administrator said, I don't have a lot of leeway in order to do this, but I'm going to help build that pathway and start finding those ways that artists can work in other departments. And so even if you're inside of a public art, as you know, and as you're saying, you have the knowledge, the value, the ability to make the case for how important artists are, individual artists, not just artworks, to making, in particular, like disrupting some of these long-term systems of inequalities, long-term, barriers to engaging communities in other ways, whether that's in health or transportation or in housing, et cetera. So like just appreciating what you're saying and just adding to that with a specific example in Minneapolis. And Minneapolis also dedicated some very specific funds during the pandemic to support artists in healing and trauma-informed approaches during the pandemic as well, in communities that have been impacted by the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, and also health and safety related issues to the pandemic. And so lots happening to look at in Minneapolis.
Those moments of disruption creating opportunity for innovation is another theme that seems to come up. And certainly we saw artists being applied in all sorts of phenomenal ways throughout the pandemic and the racial justice reckoning our country has faced, continues to face. I'm going to take the last question. Before I do, I wanted to quickly share the screen so that we can offer contact for how folks can stay engaged with Forecast Public Art. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to Forecast for joining us today, for sharing your wisdom and your talent. Thanks as always to GIA for being our partners and our supporters in this work. To Jen and Estrella in creating this work. It's amazing to collaborate with you always. And it wouldn't be, don't forget to register for the next Cultural Policy Action Lab, where we're going to talk about arts education and youth development on Wednesday, August 3rd, with our friends at Creative Generation. The saga continues. And I can think of no more appropriate way to end a policy conversation than to talk about procurement, our friend procurement. And the last question that we had in the Q&A, although it looks like another one just came in, is, are there ways that you're looking at, even beyond public art, are there ways that you're looking at procurement? Maybe it's through Change Lab, maybe it's through your listening sessions, but procurement is consistently a point of challenge for artists, for individuals, for underinvested communities, to be able to engage the public sector. What are some other promising practices or some other models that you might be looking at in terms of procurement?
I'll just share one quick example that we're doing right now. We're working with the Minneapolis Park and Recs Board to hire 9 muralists to paint murals across the city, in parks across the city, related to the Parks for All plan that the park board is developing. But their procurement process is really cumbersome. So they're actually contracting with us to contract with the artists and make those payments, because it's much simpler and we can get those payments to them much faster.
Some municipalities are opting to, just echoing what Jen says, are opting to outsource some of that procurement process to local arts organizations. And I'm not talking about local arts agencies. That kind of ticks the box for them as far as like staff capacity, and in procurement, there's also public meetings and that sort of calendar that those things need to follow as well. So that's sort of a trend that they're subcontracting some of those services to nearby offices of arts and culture.
Well, friends, I think we did it. I think we successfully talked about public art and advancing racial equity through public policy and public art. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us in this session. Thank you, Forecast, for the generosity of your time. And we hope to see everyone again in a couple of weeks.